The fog came in low that morning, rolling across the forest road like something with intention. It swallowed the pavement in thick gray waves, muffling sound and turning the towering pines into dark silhouettes that could have been watching or sleeping. The air tasted of damp earth and moss, cold enough to sting the lungs. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound until she appeared. The little girl materialized from the mist like a ghost taking shape. Her dusty rose dress torn and streaked with mud that looked almost black in the dim light. She ran barefoot down the center of the road, her arms pumping frantically, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tore from her chest. She wasn't jogging. She wasn't playing. She was running for her life. Her feet slapped against the wet asphalt, leaving bloody prints that vanished into the fog behind her. Her dark hair hung in tangled ropes across her face, and when she stumbled, catching herself on trembling hands before pushing upright again. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence. She ran until she saw them. 2 black luxury cars sat in formation across both lanes, engines idling with the deep purr of expensive machinery. They blocked the road completely, as if they had been waiting for something or someone. Chrome gleamed through the mist. Tinted windows reflected nothing but gray. The vehicles looked like they'd been carved from shadow and steel. The little girl didn't hesitate. She didn't slow down. She ran straight toward them, her voice breaking the morning open. "Help!" The word ripped from her throat, raw and desperate. "Please, someone help." The door of the lead car opened. A man stepped out with the unhurried grace of someone accustomed to control. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit with a black shirt beneath no tie. The suit jacket hung open, revealing intricate tattoos that covered his chest and crawled up his neck in bold patterns, symbols, and script that told stories most people wouldn't want to read. More ink decorated both his hands, visible even from a distance. His dark hair was slicked back, his face composed and unreadable. He looked dangerous in the way expensive things often are. His name was Dominic Vance, and in certain circles, that name carried weight that could crush bones. Behind him, 2 more car doors opened in synchronized silence. 3 men emerged, each wearing dark suits with white shirts and ties, each moving with the same disciplined precision. They spread out naturally, hands resting near concealed weapons, eyes scanning the fog-choked Trian with the practiced vigilance of soldiers. These were not bodyguards. They were an extension of Dominic's will. The little girl stumbled toward Dominic, her legs finally betraying her. She collapsed to her knees 3 feet from his polished shoes. Mud splashing across the pavement, her hands shot out toward him, fingers curled like claws. "They hung my sister on a tree," she sobbed, the words tumbling out between gasps. "Please, you have to save her. Please." Dominic didn't flinch. Standing over the broken child like a shadow carved from ice, his calculating gaze swept over the brutal rope burns biting into her wrists and the violent trembling of her exhausted body. She had fought. She had run for her life. One of his enforcers shifted, instinctively reaching for his weapon, but Dominic held up a single hand. Absolute silence fell instantly over the convoy. He looked down at the girl's tear-streaked face, recognizing the exact difference between blind hysteria and severe trauma. "Show me," his voice commanded, quiet, highly controlled, and carrying a weight that demanded absolute obedience. The girl lifted a shaking hand and pointed toward the dense upstate forest, aiming her small finger toward a dark wall of trees that disappeared into fog, so thick it looked perfectly solid. "In there, not far, I ran so fast." Her voice broke completely as she doubled over and pressed her muddy forehead against the cold pavement. Dominic glanced at his top enforcers and no further words were spoken because none were needed. The powerful car engine shut off one by one, and heavy doors closed with soft final clicks. 3 highly trained men moved into a tight tactical formation around Dominic without being told, their hands now resting openly on heavy weapons concealed beneath their tailored jackets. Dominic looked down at the trembling child again and calmly commanded her to stand up. The girl struggled to her bare feet, swaying dangerously until Dominic caught her elbow and steadied her. She stared up at him with wide and red-rimmed eyes that held far more hope than any child should ever have to place in a stranger. "You lead, we follow," Dominic said simply. 8-year-old Lily nodded frantically, and she was already turning toward the dark forest before she took 3 steps and her weak legs buckled once again. This time Dominic didn't wait, and he lifted her effortlessly, settling her against his side with one strong arm as she weighed almost nothing. "Hold on," he said, and it was not a gentle suggestion, but a firm command. She wrapped her thin arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder, letting her hot tears soak right through his expensive suit jacket. Dominic completely ignored the dampness and moved straight toward the tree line, with his men falling into perfect tactical formation around him. One enforcer took the point position ahead, while 2 others guarded the flanks, and they entered the forest as a single lethal unit. They were swallowed immediately by the thick fog and deep shadows as the trail the girl directed them down became barely visible. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in as many steps, and Dominic felt the child's frantic heartbeat slamming directly against his own chest. His men moved completely silently with their heavy weapons now drawn and their sharp eyes scanning every single shadow. They knew this extremely tense feeling because they had walked into violent ambushes before, but this specific environment felt much heavier and entirely wrong. The upstate forest suddenly opened up, and the towering pines pulled back like heavy curtains revealing a very grim stage. A wide clearing lay dead ahead, appearing circular and unnaturally empty in the morning mist. In the absolute center stood a massive oak tree, ancient and fiercely gnarled, its thick branches spreading wide like silent judgment. Hanging from those sturdy branches, swaying just slightly in a cold breeze that did not seem to exist anywhere else, was a young woman. Lily screamed right into Dominic's shoulder, but his cold expression never changed even as his grip on the child tightened and his free hand moved smoothly to his primary weapon. "Check her," Dominic said quietly to his point man. One of his enforcers immediately sprinted forward across the muddy ground. The man who reached 24-year-old Clara first was a former military operative whose lethal hands had seen more extreme violence than most normal people could ever imagine. As he quickly pressed 2 fingers against the young woman's bruised neck, searching for a faint pulse beneath her freezing skin, those exact same hands actually trembled. "She's alive," the enforcer called back, his tight voice barely carrying through the thick morning fog. Dominic did not acknowledge the profound relief that normally should have followed those hopeful words, because relief was a useless luxury and immediate action was an absolute necessity. He expertly shifted Lily in his arms, firmly turning her dirty face away from the horrifying sight of her older sister hanging totally limp against the thick ropes. "Don't look," Dominic ordered quietly, offering no warm comfort but demanding strict obedience. Lily buried her face much deeper into his dark shoulder, her small body shaking violently with dry sobs that had absolutely no sound left inside them. She had simply screamed herself entirely empty during her desperate run, and now Dominic's other 2 men sprang into action with immediate military precision. One enforcer pulled a sharp tactical knife from his heavy belt and began scaling the massive oak tree with the total efficiency of a man who had done much harder climbs under far worse combat conditions. The other guard positioned himself directly beneath Clara's dangling body with his strong arms raised high, standing fully ready to catch her dead weight the exact moment the thick ropes were finally cut. Dominic carefully watched them work while his brilliant tactical mind raced at least 3 steps ahead of the current grim situation. Whoever had committed this brutal atrocity was likely not very far away, because the severe rope burns on little Lily's wrists proved she had been heavily restrained. The fresh wet mud on her torn dress meant she had fallen multiple times while frantically running, and the sheer terror in her wild eyes meant the violent men who had strung up her sister were the vicious kind who made bloody examples instead of issuing idle threats. They were definitely still close, and they had to be violently dealt with. Above them in the thick canopy, the enforcer's heavy tactical knife sawed aggressively through the tight rope with extremely deliberate care. "Ready," the climber called down to his partner standing below. "Go," he shouted, and the thick rope parted with a harsh sound exactly like a dying sigh. Clara's bruised body dropped instantly, and the man below caught her with highly surprising gentleness before lowering her immediately to the damp forest ground. The first enforcer was beside her in mere seconds, rapidly checking her fading vitals and precisely assessing her severe physical damage with hands that moved just like a trauma doctor's. "Pulse is very weak, but holding steady," the man reported quickly as his fingers moved from her bruised neck down to her badly cut wrists. He examined the deep raw rope burns that had violently sliced straight into her pale flesh. "She is possible hypothermia and severe shock. She needs a real hospital right now." "No hospitals," Dominic stated immediately, and all three enforcers looked right at him in absolute silence. They knew far better than to openly question their boss, but the heavy silence itself acted as an unspoken question hanging in the cold air. Dominic set Lily down very gently onto the wet grass, keeping one strong hand firmly on her small shoulder just to steady her shaking frame. She immediately tried to run toward her injured sister, but he held her back with quiet and absolute firmness. "Not yet. You must let my men work on her first," Dominic commanded smoothly. "But she is alive because we actually got here in time, and she stays alive only if you let my men help her right now." Dominic's incredibly dark eyes forcefully held the little girl's terrified gaze. "Trust me or do not trust me, but if you want her to live, you will listen." Lily swallowed hard and nodded frantically, her small dirty hand gripping Dominic's expensive jacket so extremely tightly that her tiny knuckles went completely white. Dominic quickly pulled out his secure phone with his free hand and dialed a private number without even looking at the glowing screen. The encrypted call connected loudly on the very first ring. "I need my private medical team completely prepped right now," he stated with his voice heavily clipped and strictly businesslike. "I have a female, 24 years old, suffering from severe exposure, heavy rope trauma, and very deep physical shock." He paused for a brief second to listen to the voice on the other end of the secure line. "No, we are not going to the city clinic. Get the suite fully ready at the upstate safe house and have everything locked down tight." He swiftly ended the call and slipped the secure phone back into his tailored pocket before returning his total attention to his waiting men. The enforcer had already descended from the large tree and was actively examining the surrounding muddy area with a predator's intense focus. He was reading the damp forest floor exactly like a detailed book written in violently disturbed leaves and freshly broken branches. "Boss," the tracker called out quietly. "I have very fresh tracks, maybe 10 heavy boots, heading northeast." Dominic's strong jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as his cold brain processed the new tactical information. "Prepare her for immediate transport back to the primary convoy," Dominic ordered his men while his dark eyes scanned the dense northern tree line. The two enforcers worked in totally synchronized silence, carefully lifting Clara's unconscious form and supporting her battered head while they moved swiftly back down the misty trail. Lily scrambled right behind them, keeping her terrified eyes locked entirely on her older sister's pale face. Dominic walked at the absolute rear of the tight formation, his hand resting casually on his concealed weapon as he shielded their steady retreat from any potential ambush. The heavy gray fog parted just enough to let the violent morning sunlight bleed through the tall pines as they finally reached the idling luxury cars. The heavy rear doors were thrown wide open, and Clara was carefully loaded across the expansive leather seats to act as a makeshift trauma stretcher. The apex predator had successfully secured his fragile prey, and now the bloody hunt for the 10 men in the woods was about to officially begin. The heavy tires of the armored Mercedes tore down the winding upstate highway, putting brutal distance between the dark forest and the fragile survivors. Inside the spacious cabin, the stark contrast between two entirely different worlds became immediately suffocating. The plush leather seats and pristine chrome fixtures gleamed under the soft interior lighting, completely untouched by the harsh realities of desperate poverty. Clara lay perfectly still across the wide back seat, her torn clothes soaked in cold mud and her pale skin marred by violent purple bruising. The expensive suspension system absorbed every single bump in the asphalt, ensuring her broken body did not suffer any further unnecessary trauma. 8-year-old Lily sat rigidly beside her older sister, clutching Clara's freezing fingers with small hands that still trembled uncontrollably from the morning's pure terror. Dominic rode in the front passenger seat, his massive frame perfectly still as his dark eyes continuously monitored them through the rearview mirror. He noticed the cheap fabric of their worn garments and the obvious signs of prolonged malnutrition that told a very grim story of daily survival. These girls lived entirely on the absolute edge of society, and now they were locked inside a rolling fortress built from millions of dollars in illegal wealth. The luxury convoy finally turned off the main highway and glided smoothly onto a highly private road completely hidden by towering evergreen trees. Massive iron gates suddenly materialized from the morning mist, standing at least 12 feet tall and reinforced with thick steel mesh designed to stop a speeding truck. The heavy gates swung open automatically as heavily armed guards in tactical gear stepped back into the shadows to let the boss pass without delay. They entered a sprawling, manicured estate that looked exactly like a billionaire's peaceful retreat, but it was actually a heavily fortified bunker designed for surviving violent syndicate wars. The pristine driveway was paved with flawless cobblestones that led directly to a massive stone mansion standing silent and imposing against the gray sky. Crystal chandeliers glowed warmly through the tall bulletproof windows, casting long, elegant shadows over the expensive imported marble statues decorating the vast front lawn. Lily pressed her dirty face against the tinted glass, her red-rimmed eyes widening in total disbelief at the sheer scale of the breathtaking sanctuary. She had never seen anything so incredibly beautiful or so deeply terrifying in her entire short life, and she instinctively shrank back against her unconscious sister. Dominic's vehicle came to a smooth halt precisely in front of the grand entrance, where a fully prepped medical team was already waiting in perfect formation. Four private doctors dressed in dark scrubs rushed forward the exact second the heavy car doors were thrown open by Dominic's disciplined enforcers. They moved with the extreme efficiency of combat medics, smoothly transferring Clara's limp body onto a portable titanium gurney without speaking a single wasted word. Dominic stepped out of the vehicle and towered over the frantic scene, his suit jacket flapping in the cold wind as he issued rapid and absolute commands. Get her stabilized immediately and prep the underground trauma suite for massive fluid replacement, he ordered coldly, his voice cutting through the morning air like a newly sharpened blade. The lead physician simply nodded and pushed the heavy gurney through the massive oak double doors, moving swiftly across the gleaming marble floors of the grand foyer. Mud and dried blood dripped from Clara's ruined clothes onto the pristine white tiles, leaving a stark trail of human suffering across the immaculate luxury of the syndicate safe house. Lily tried desperately to follow the rolling gurney, but her exhausted legs finally gave out, and she collapsed hard onto the polished stone floor. Dominic did not flinch, and he scooped the sobbing child up into his strong arms once again, carrying her effortlessly past the priceless artwork hanging on the silk-covered walls. He carried her deep into the hidden bowels of the massive estate, descending through a concealed elevator that led to a state-of-the-art medical facility completely off the official grid. The air down here smelled sharply of sterile bleach and cold rubbing alcohol, a stark departure from the damp earth and raw blood of the horrific forest. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as the medical team hooked Clara up to advanced heart monitors and established multiple intravenous lines to pump warm fluids into her failing veins. Lily squirmed in Dominic's firm grip, kicking her bare and bloody feet as she frantically demanded to be put down right next to her dying sister. He set her down gently but forcefully in a padded leather observation chair directly outside the primary glass partition, pointing a heavily tattooed finger at her tear-streaked face. "You stay exactly here, and you do not interfere with their crucial work, or I will have my men lock you in a different room," he warned her with zero trace of gentle paternal warmth. It was a harsh and unyielding threat, but it was exactly the kind of concrete boundary the deeply traumatized child desperately needed to anchor her spinning mind. She instantly froze and nodded obediently, curling her small, muddy body into a tight ball on the oversized designer chair while she watched the doctors save her only family. Dominic stood silently beside her for a long time, watching the frantic medical activity through the reinforced glass, while his brilliant mind continued to meticulously calculate the deadly variables. He observed the extremely cheap, worn-out sneakers carefully removed from Clara's bruised feet, noting the large holes in the thin soles that spoke volumes about her crushing daily poverty. The young woman was severely underweight, her fragile ribs clearly visible beneath her torn shirt as the private surgeons carefully cleaned her horrific rope burns. She was a total nobody from the forgotten gutters of the city, yet someone had expended massive criminal resources to string her up like a slaughtered animal. The sheer contrast between her desperate, hollow-cheeked starvation and the millions of dollars of life-saving equipment currently surrounding her was deeply jarring even to a hardened killer like Dominic. He had built this incredible underground fortress to protect highly valuable syndicate lieutenants from ruthless cartel assassins, not to shelter starving orphans from petty street thugs. Yet here they were, violently bleeding all over his perfectly clean floors and dragging his protected world into their chaotic nightmare. He pulled his secure phone from his tailored pocket, his dark eyes hardening into pure obsidian as he prepared to shift his entire focus from saving lives to actively ending them. His most trusted enforcer stepped quietly into the sterile observation room, moving with the heavy grace of a man who had already chambered a round in his concealed pistol. The perimeter is completely locked down and the exterior guards have been fully doubled on all 4 main gates, the lethal man reported in a low and gravelly whisper. Dominic did not take his eyes off the flashing heart monitors connected to Clara's chest, watching the jagged green lines slowly stabilize as the powerful drugs finally took hold. Keep the child fed and do not let anyone besides the lead surgeon enter this specific medical wing under any circumstances whatsoever, Dominic commanded with absolute lethal authority. "What about the 10 men we tracked back in the upstate woods?" the enforcer asked, his scarred face tightening with the dark anticipation of sanctioned violence. Dominic finally turned away from the medical glass, his expensive suit perfectly crisp despite the morning's intense physical labor and the dried blood staining his white cuffs. "Gather the primary strike team and fully arm them with silenced tactical rifles, because we are going hunting right now," Dominic stated coldly as he walked toward the secure elevator. He was leaving the heavily fortified sanctuary of the shadows behind, fully prepared to become the apex predator those foolish men had unknowingly summoned from the freezing fog. The tracker moved through the thick upstate woods like a silent phantom. He followed the deep boot prints and the fresh tire tracks that led straight away from the massive oak tree. The trail staked for 5 miles through dense pines and rocky ravines before finally ending at a decaying hunting cabin. The wooden structure sat heavily in a natural depression, completely surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence and overgrown weeds. Plumes of gray smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney, blending perfectly with the freezing evening mist. Inside, loud voices and the harsh clinking of cheap beer bottles echoed through the thin timber walls. 12 heavily armed men occupied the cramped space, utterly confident that their brutal morning work was entirely finished. They did not realize that the dark forest had already judged them, and their executioners were currently surrounding their flimsy sanctuary. Dominic crouched perfectly still just beyond the tree line, his custom tactical rifle resting easily against his broad shoulder. His elite strike team consisted of 8 lethal ghosts dressed in matte black tactical gear, and they waited patiently for his silent command. Dominic raised his left hand and dropped 2 fingers in a sharp downward motion. The breach was absolute, and it was terrifyingly precise. Heavy flashbang grenades shattered the dirty glass windows simultaneously, exploding with the blinding white light and a deafening concussion that violently shook the wooden foundations. The cabin doors were kicked off their rusted hinges before the thick chemical smoke could even begin to clear. Dominic stepped straight into the absolute chaos with the cold composure of a man walking into his own living room. His silenced rifle coughed quietly in the confined space, spitting deadly rounds that dropped 3 armed men before they could even reach for their holstered weapons. His enforcers swept through the back rooms like a violent storm, executing the disoriented hostiles with ruthless military efficiency. There was no chaotic shouting from Dominic's men, only the calculated double taps of suppressed gunfire and the heavy thuds of dead weight hitting the filthy floorboards. 10 men were permanently erased from the world in less than 20 seconds, their blood pooling darkly across the rotting wood. Dominic signaled a strict ceasefire as the remaining 2 men were violently thrown to their knees in the center of the ruined living room. The 2 survivors shook violently, their ears bleeding from the intense explosive pressure and their eyes wide with absolute terror. One of them had a crude snake tattooed across his thick neck, and he stared up at Dominic like he was looking directly at the devil himself. "Who gave the order to hang the girl?" Dominic asked quietly, his deep voice slicing right through the ringing silence of the bloody cabin. The tattooed man clamped his jaw shut, trying desperately to find some useless shred of street courage in front of his crew. Dominic did not repeat the simple question, nor did he raise his voice or show any outward anger. He simply drew his heavy sidearm and shot the man directly in the kneecap without a single flinch. The tattooed man screamed in sudden agony, collapsing sideways into the pooling blood while his terrified partner instantly broke. It was Marcus Thorne, the second man babbled frantically, the desperate words tearing from his throat in a rush to survive. He gave the direct order to make a bloody example out of her for the entire neighborhood to see. Dominic absorbed the familiar name instantly, immediately recognizing the ambitious young syndicate boss who had been aggressively expanding his illegal territory across the eastern seaboard. Why did Thorne want an example made of a starving girl? Dominic pressed coldly, stepping just an inch closer to the trembling survivor. The bleeding man on the floor groaned violently, but his terrified partner kept his shaking hands raised high in the freezing air. Her dead father owed Thorne a massive gambling debt, and it rolled directly over to her when he took a bullet last year. The man choked out rapidly. It was $150,000, and she could not even pay the weekly interest, so Thorne told us to string her up to show everyone else what happens when you default. Dominic's dark eyes narrowed slightly as his brilliant mind calculated the absolute absurdity of the brutal situation. A rising Mafia boss had sent 12 armed killers to violently execute a helpless 24-year-old girl over an inherited debt she could never possibly repay. It was incredibly bad business, it was unnecessarily cruel, and it deeply offended Dominic's strict professional code of controlled violence. He looked down at the 2 broken men shivering on the bloody floorboards, fully realizing that keeping Clara alive had just placed him directly in Marcus Thorne's crosshairs. Dominic raised his weapon one final time and fired 2 silenced rounds, ensuring the dark forest kept its bloody secrets permanently before turning his broad back on the ghost of Clara's deadly mistake. Clara drifted upward through a thick ocean of pain and blinding white light. Her heavy eyelids fluttered open, revealing a sterile ceiling that smelled sharply of expensive bleach and rubbing alcohol. She tried to move her arms, but hot agony flared instantly around her heavily bandaged wrists. The rhythmic beeping of advanced heart monitors filled the quiet room, completely replacing the terrifying silence of the dark upstate forest. She gasped for air as the horrific memories came crashing back in a violent tidal wave of mud and rough hemp ropes. Her dark eyes darted frantically around the pristine medical suite, searching desperately for any sign of her younger sister. Panic seized her raw throat when she found herself completely alone in the high-tech bed, surrounded by humming machines and polished glass. She ripped the intravenous lines straight out of her bruised arm, ignoring the sudden bloom of bright red blood against the white sheets. She swung her bare feet over the edge of the mattress, fully prepared to fight her way out of whatever nightmare she had just entered. Then the heavy steel door clicked open with a quiet mechanical hiss, and a massive shadow completely filled the bright doorway. Dominic Vance stepped slowly into the sterile room, moving with the quiet lethality of a true apex predator inspecting his captive prey. He wore a fresh black suit that looked exactly as expensive and dangerous as the man himself, his dark eyes completely unreadable as they locked onto her trembling form. He did not rush forward to help her, nor did he offer any warm words of gentle comfort. He simply stood perfectly still and let his overwhelming physical presence crush the remaining oxygen right out of the small room. Clara froze completely, instinctively recognizing the absolute violence radiating from his broad shoulders and the intricate tattoos crawling up his thick neck. "Your sister is perfectly safe, and she is sleeping in the next room," Dominic stated calmly, his deep voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. He pointed a steady finger at her bleeding arm, casually commanding her to sit back down before she tore any more stitches. Clara did not move, her defensive instincts warring violently against the cold logic of her current situation. "Who are you?" she rasped weakly, her throat still severely bruised from the heavy ropes that had nearly snapped her neck. "I am the man who cut you down from that oak tree, and now we are going to have a very honest conversation," Dominic replied evenly. Dominic pulled a heavy steel chair directly to the edge of her medical bed and sat down with unhurried grace. He leaned forward slightly, resting his heavily tattooed hands on his dark knees while he studied her battered face with clinical precision. "I paid a brief visit to the hunting cabin in the woods, and the 12 men who strung you up will never bother anyone ever again," he informed her casually. Clara gasped sharply, her wide eyes reflecting a sudden mixture of profound relief and absolute terror at the casual confession of mass murder. One of the survivors was very talkative before the end, and he mentioned a rising syndicate boss named Marcus Thorne. Dominic continued smoothly. He watched her pale face drain of whatever little color it had left, noting exactly how her entire body flinched at the mere mention of that ruthless name. "You are a starving girl from the deep gutters, yet Thorne sent a heavily armed hit squad to execute you over an inherited debt of $150,000, Dominic stated, laying the harsh facts out on the sterile sheets between them. "I want to know exactly how a dead man's gambling debt became your bloody problem, and I want the absolute truth right now." Clara wrapped her bandaged arms around her thin chest, trying desperately to shield herself from his intense, interrogating stare. "My father owed him that money, and Thorne said blood debts pass directly to the eldest child when the father takes a bullet," she whispered brokenly, the shameful truth finally tumbling out into the cold room. Dominic processed her desperate confession without a single flicker of human sympathy crossing his stone-carved features. He understood the brutal mechanics of the street perfectly, but Thorne's highly public execution method was a direct insult to the quiet efficiency of true organized crime. "Thorne wanted to make a bloody example out of you to terrify his entire neighborhood, but he made a very critical error by leaving you alive long enough for me to find you," Dominic said quietly. Clara looked deeply into his obsidian eyes and finally understood that the man sitting beside her was a far greater monster than Marcus Thorne could ever hope to be. He did not operate on petty street extortion. He operated on absolute and unquestioned power, and right now he held her fragile life entirely in his calloused hands. "What are you going to do to us?" Clara asked, her voice shaking as she realized she had simply traded one lethal predator for another. Dominic stood up slowly, his massive frame blocking out the bright fluorescent lights overhead. "I am going to keep you and your sister locked safely inside this estate," and then I am going to teach Marcus Thorne exactly why he should never practice his sloppy business in my territory," Dominic promised coldly. He turned his broad back on her and walked straight out of the medical room, leaving Clara fully awake in a beautiful gilded cage constructed entirely of blood and shadows. Marcus Thorne did not become a rising syndicate boss by throwing blind tantrums when things went wrong. He sat in his velvet-lined office above the city, and he stared completely blankly at the encrypted photographs glowing on his secure tablet. 12 of his most violent enforcers were laid out across the rotting floorboards of the upstate hunting cabin, and their bodies were punctured by terrifyingly precise groupings of suppressed rifle fire. The local police had not found the bloody scene yet, but his own sweeping crew had discovered the absolute slaughter just before midnight. Thorne zoomed in on the high-resolution images, his sharp eyes noting the distinct lack of chaotic shell casings and the perfectly calculated execution angles. This was not a messy rival gang dispute, and it certainly was not the desperate work of local street thugs. This was a highly orchestrated military strike executed by men who actively hunted other professional killers for a living. His heavy-hit squad had been entirely erased from the map in less than 1 minute, and the hanging girl was nowhere to be found. Thorne set the expensive tablet face down on his mahogany desk, feeling a sudden chill creep straight up his tailored spine. He needed absolute answers immediately, but he knew far better than to send more loud men blindly into the dark. Thorne drove himself silently to the decaying tenement building on the ragged edge of the city, wearing a plain gray coat to blend perfectly into the miserable surroundings. The rusted front door of Clara's cramped apartment hung slightly ajar, its cheap brass lock already picked completely clean by whoever had swept the place before him. He stepped carefully over the peeling linoleum threshold and breathed in the heavy scent of stale water and desperate poverty. The tiny rooms were completely tossed, but the thorough search was done with an extremely methodical coldness rather than frantic anger. Cheap wooden drawers were neatly removed, thin floorboards were carefully pried up, and every single piece of personal identification had been thoroughly scrubbed from the dirty space. Thorne crouched down near the cracked bedroom window, his sharp eyes catching a tiny glimmer of expensive metal half buried in the dusty radiator grating. He reached out and pulled a heavy silver casing from the deep shadows, turning it slowly between his perfectly manicured fingers. It was a custom-machined bullet casing, polished to a mirror shine and stamped with a very specific, highly illegal armory mark on the flat bottom. The heavy silver brass felt incredibly cold against his bare skin, and the terrifying reality of his massive mistake finally crashed over him like a suffocating wave. Only one man on the entire eastern seaboard equipped his private strike teams with that exact specific caliber of custom ammunition. Thorne stood up slowly in the cramped and rotting apartment, and the crushing weight of the silver casing suddenly felt like a heavy tombstone resting right in his palm. He had sent 12 loud men to hang a starving girl over a petty gambling debt, and somehow that trivial action had summoned the absolute apex predator of the criminal underworld. Dominic Vance had personally stepped out of the shadows to claim the terrified girl, and he had slaughtered Thorne's entire crew just to send a very quiet message. Thorne crushed the cold casing tightly in his sweating fist, fully realizing his arrogant territorial expansion had just ignited a lethal war he was severely unprepared to fight. He walked straight out of the miserable tenement building without making a single sound, his brilliant mind already racing desperately to build massive defenses against a monster who never missed his targets. 3 days passed inside the fortified upstate estate, and the crushing luxury quickly began to feel exactly like a suffocating prison. Clara was moved from the underground medical suite into a sprawling guest bedroom on the 3rd floor, but the heavy oak door remained constantly guarded by 2 silent men in tailored suits. The massive windows offered breathtaking views of the manicured grounds and the distant tree line, yet the reinforced glass was completely bulletproof and permanently locked from the outside. She paced across the plush Persian rugs for hours, her bare feet sinking into the expensive wool while her bandaged wrists throbbed with a dull and constant ache. Lily spent her afternoons watching giant flat-screen televisions and eating gourmet meals prepared by a private chef, her childhood innocence slowly returning under the absolute safety of the syndicate roof. Clara could not find that same peaceful rest because every single fiber of her street-hardened instincts screamed at her to keep moving and keep running. She hated being entirely dependent on a ruthless apex predator, and the severe lack of personal autonomy gnawed violently at her frayed nerves. She was a surviving ghost trapped inside a billionaire's heavily armed vault, and the beautiful gilded cage was slowly driving her completely insane. She finally broke the suffocating silence on the fourth morning and marched straight past the heavy oak door. The two armed guards immediately stepped into her path, their broad shoulders completely blocking the wide hallway and their hands resting casually near their concealed weapons. "I need to speak directly with Dominic Vance right now," Clara demanded, her bruised voice echoing sharply against the pristine marble walls. The enforcers did not move or speak. They simply stared right past her with the disciplined blankness of stone statues until the secure elevator chimed loudly at the end of the corridor. Dominic stepped out into the bright hallway, his dark suit perfectly pressed and his entire presence instantly dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He dismissed the two guards with a single microscopic nod, and they vanished immediately into the shadows like obedient phantoms. Clara stood her ground despite the violent trembling in her weak legs, crossing her bandaged arms tightly across her chest as she glared up at the towering Mafia boss. "I refuse to be kept as a helpless pet in your massive house," she stated firmly. "I demand to know exactly when my sister and I can finally leave this place." Dominic looked down at her with those terrifyingly cold obsidian eyes, completely unbothered by her desperate display of hollow bravado. He did not raise his deep voice or offer any gentle apologies for her strict confinement. He simply turned and led her toward the massive bulletproof window at the end of the long corridor, gesturing calmly toward the heavy iron gates standing far in the distance. "Marcus Thorne has currently placed a massive $50,000 bounty on your head," Dominic stated with clinical precision. "Every single street thug in the city is actively hunting for the surviving girl from the oak tree." Dominic explained that if she walked out of those steel gates right now, Thorne's vicious men would capture her before nightfall, and they would definitely not bother using a rope the second time. Clara stared out at the sprawling green lawn and suddenly saw the hidden snipers positioned carefully on the high slate roof and the heavily armed tactical patrols walking the distant perimeter. The staggering reality of the violent Mafia war finally crashed over her, completely washing away her foolish pride and her desperate desire for blind freedom. She looked back at Dominic's scarred and unreadable face, realizing with absolute clarity that his cold brutality was not a heavy chain binding her to the floor. His terrifying criminal empire was actually the only true and unbreakable shield standing between her little sister and the vicious monsters waiting in the dark. Clara swallowed her fierce pride and slowly nodded her head, finally accepting the harsh protection of the apex predator and the absolute safety of her beautiful gilded cage. Clara sat by the reinforced window and watched the heavily armed guards patrol the expansive green grounds below. She realized with sudden clarity that passively waiting in this beautiful room was simply another form of slowly dying. She absolutely refused to be a helpless liability while a violent Mafia war raged just outside the heavy iron gates entirely because of her. She looked down at her heavily bandaged wrists and remembered the brutal months she had spent working off the impossible interest of her dead father's debt. Marcus Thorne had viciously forced her to scrub filthy floors and haul heavy liquor crates in the freezing dark basement of his underground nightclub just to survive another miserable week. She had always kept her bruised head down to avoid the cruel hands of his violent enforcers, but she had kept her desperate eyes completely open. She actually knew the highly secret layout of his illegal underground operation far better than most of his own careless and arrogant lieutenants. She stood up with sudden fierce determination and walked straight past her silent guards without asking for their useless permission. She firmly demanded to be taken directly to Dominic's private command center, and this time she did not shake or hesitate in the slightest. The heavy mahogany doors of the massive study swung open to reveal Dominic standing intensely over a large table covered in detailed city maps. His top lieutenants fell totally silent as the fragile girl stepped right into the absolute heart of the heavily guarded syndicate war room. Dominic did not aggressively order her out, and he simply gestured with one heavily tattooed hand for his dangerous men to step back into the deep shadows. Clara walked right up to the heavy wooden table and looked directly into Dominic's cold and unreadable obsidian eyes. "I know exactly where Marcus Thorne hides the real money and the dirty ledgers," she stated firmly without a single tremor in her bruised voice. "I worked forced labor shifts in the terrible basement of the Velvet Room for 8 solid months just to pay his weekly extortion fees." Dominic slowly crossed his thick arms over his broad chest and leaned forward with sudden and intense predatory interest. He already knew that specific club was Thorne's primary financial hub, but the internal security was notoriously tight and always heavily armed. Clara politely asked for a cheap pen, and she began drawing a highly detailed schematic right across the blank margins of his expensive tactical mats. Her shaking hands flew rapidly across the thick paper as she precisely mapped out the twisting underground corridors and the heavily guarded interior access points. She carefully explained that Thorne kept 2 entirely separate sets of accounting ledgers to constantly fool the rival bosses and the corrupt local police. The fake business books were stored openly inside the main office safe, but the real ledgers were hidden deep inside a false ventilation shaft directly behind the basement liquor room. The heavy steel door to the basement is electronically locked from the inside, but the secondary power box is completely exposed in the rusted back alleyway, Clara explained rapidly. She drew a sharp and dark cross directly over the narrow back alley and detailed the highly specific delivery schedules that kept the illegal club running. Every single Thursday night at exactly 2 in the morning, unmarked armored trucks backed into that specific blind spot to unload illicit cargo and heavy cash boxes. She knew this precise timing perfectly because Thorne always made her scrub the bloody alleyway stones immediately after the heavy trucks finally departed into the dark. She handed the cheap pen back to Dominic and took a deep, shuddering breath, offering him the absolute key to completely dismantling his enemy's entire empire. Dominic studied the chaotic blue ink with the absolute intense focus of a master chess player calculating a highly lethal checkmate. He swiftly cross-referenced her crude handwritten drawings with his own highly sophisticated surveillance photographs, and the critical puzzle pieces locked together with terrifying perfection. He looked up at Clara and saw the fierce, unbroken survivor shining brightly right through the exhausted and battered victim, and a cold spark of genuine respect finally ignited in his dark eyes. "Get the advance reconnaissance team on the secure line right now," Dominic ordered his lead enforcer without ever looking away from her pale face. He instantly dispatched 3 elite scouts directly to the narrow alleyway behind the Velvet Room to physically verify the exposed power box and the camera blind spots she had mapped out. The sprawling study fell into incredibly tense silence as the hardened Mafia men waited anxiously for the field reports to validate the starving girl's incredible tactical claims. Clara stood completely still beside the massive table, her heart hammering violently against her bruised ribs as she staked her entire worth on her traumatized memory. She was actively pushing herself deep into the bloody syndicate war, and there was absolutely no turning back to the quiet safety of her beautiful gilded cage. The encrypted radio rusting on the heavy table finally crackled to life after 2 agonizing hours of completely dead silence. The lead scout's gravelly voice filled the quiet room, firmly confirming that the rusted power box was exactly where Clara said it would be. The seasoned scout also verified that the heavy security cameras possessed a massive 10-foot blind spot right near the underground liquor room's exterior delivery hatch. Dominic quickly picked up the radio and ordered his lethal men to hold their hidden positions and fully prepare for a massive coordinated strike. He slowly set the heavy radio down and turned his full attention back to the brave young woman standing tall in his dangerous war room. "You just handed me the sharpest possible blade to completely gut his entire financial operation," Dominic stated quietly, openly acknowledging her incredible tactical value in front of his most dangerous men. Clara was no longer just a broken piece of collateral damage rescued from a freezing upstate forest. She had officially transitioned into an active and highly dangerous asset within Dominic's terrifying world, and Thorne's arrogant empire was about to burn straight to the ground entirely because of the very girl he tried to execute. Midnight in Manhattan was usually a symphony of distant sirens and grinding steel, but the sudden explosion on Fifth Avenue silenced the entire city block. A high-end logistics firm handling millions in offshore accounts for the Vance Syndicate was completely gutted in a brilliant flash of searing white heat. Heavy glass rained down upon the empty sidewalks like a deadly crystal storm, and the concussive shockwave shattered every single window for 3 solid blocks. The resulting fire burned with unnatural ferocity, thick black smoke billowing up into the freezing night sky like a massive signal flare. It was not a random act of street violence, and it certainly was not an accidental gas leak. This was a highly sophisticated incendiary device planted with extreme precision to cause maximum structural devastation without leaving any trace of the bomber. Marcus Thorne had struck back with terrifying speed, completely bypassing the lower-level street enforcers and aiming directly at the beating financial heart of Dominic's massive empire. The roaring flames consumed months of carefully laundered cash and completely destroyed vital shipping manifests, but the actual monetary loss was entirely secondary to the profound disrespect of the violent act itself. The secure satellite phone sitting on Dominic's heavy mahogany desk vibrated violently at exactly 2 in the morning. He answered the encrypted call in absolute silence, his dark eyes fixed completely on the burning embers in the massive stone fireplace. His lead enforcer in the city delivered the grim casualty report and the staggering financial damage with the clipped efficiency of a seasoned battlefield commander. 3 loyal accountants and 2 heavily armed night watchmen were completely vaporized in the initial blast, their bodies entirely erased by Thorne's ruthless escalation. Dominic did not shout in sudden rage, and he did not throw his expensive glass of dark bourbon against the pristine wall. He simply absorbed the staggering violence with chilling calmness, his brilliant mind already calculating the massive bloody toll this new war would actively demand. He slowly hung up the secure phone and watched the fire dance across the heavy logs, realizing that a petty dispute over a starving girl had just mutated into a full-scale syndicate war. He had kept the fragile peace in the city for 5 solid years through absolute intimidation, but now that carefully maintained illusion of total control had been violently shattered by a rising upstart. Clara stood frozen in the dark hallway just outside the study, her bare feet totally silent against the expensive wool runners as she listened to the grim aftermath. She had come downstairs to simply get a glass of cold water, but the heavy scent of impending death leaking from the war room stopped her completely dead in her tracks. She knew instantly that Thorne had brutally retaliated, and the crushing guilt of bringing this massive devastation down upon Dominic's protected house threatened to suffocate her entirely. She stepped cautiously into the dim light of the study, wrapping her thin robe tightly around her shivering frame as she looked at the apex predator standing by the dying fire. "He bombed your building because you saved me," she whispered, her voice trembling violently with the sheer weight of the innocent blood now spilled on her behalf. Dominic turned his massive shoulders and looked directly at her, his obsidian eyes completely devoid of any gentle mercy or lingering doubt. "Marcus Thorne bombed my building because he is a foolish dead man walking, and he simply chose tonight to finally sign his own bloody death warrant," Dominic stated with absolute lethal conviction. The destructive warning had been firmly delivered, the invisible lines had been violently crossed, and now the entire city was going to brutally bleed for the incredible mistake of challenging the king. The heavy steel gates of the upstate estate opened silently in the dead of night, and Dominic Vance rode in the back of an armored SUV heading straight for the bleeding heart of the city. He wore a matte black tactical vest over his tailored shirt, and his dark eyes reflected the passing streetlights like polished obsidian. His elite strike team followed in 3 unmarked vehicles, moving through the empty Manhattan streets with the synchronized precision of a predatory wolf pack. They arrived at the narrow back alley directly behind the Velvet Room at exactly 2 in the morning. The freezing air smelled of rotting garbage and stale beer, but the tactical layout was exactly as Clara had drawn it. A heavy unmarked armored truck was already backed up to the loading dock, its diesel engine rumbling low and steady in the dark. Dominic raised his gloved hand, and his highly trained enforcers immediately fanned out into the deep shadows. The security cameras were completely blind in this specific corner, and the exposed power box hummed loudly against the rusted brick wall. Dominic did not bring an army to fight Marcus Thorne, because an apex predator only needs a few sharp teeth to completely sever an artery. One of Dominic's technical specialists stepped forward and jammed a heavy steel pry bar directly into the rusted power box. He severed the thick main cables with a sudden shower of blue sparks, and the entire underground loading bay was instantly plunged into absolute darkness. The heavy steel delivery door swung open from the inside as 2 of Thorne's distracted guards stepped out to investigate the sudden electrical outage. Dominic moved faster than the human eye could physically track, stepping right out of the freezing shadows and grabbing the first guard by his thick throat. He crushed the man's windpipe with a sickening crunch, dropping him completely silently to the wet pavement while his enforcers dragged the second guard into the dark. They slipped inside the massive underground basement, stepping lightly over wooden crates of smuggled liquor and stacked boxes of illegal narcotics. The air down here was incredibly thick and suffocating, completely matching Clara's terrified descriptions of her forced underground labor. 5 more heavily armed guards patrolled the twisting concrete corridors, but they were completely blind in the sudden blackout and highly disoriented by the utter silence. Dominic's men used suppressed weapons and heavy combat knives, moving through the dark basement like a violent plague and erasing every single hostile before they could even reach for their radios. The entire underground perimeter was violently secured in less than 3 minutes, and absolutely no one upstairs in the crowded club had any idea that their financial heart had just officially stopped beating. Dominic walked confidently past the fake office safe and moved directly toward the rusted ventilation shaft hidden entirely behind the massive liquor racks. He kicked the heavy steel grate loose with one brutal strike from his combat boot, revealing a hidden concrete cavity filled with heavy metal lockboxes. He pulled the true accounting ledgers from the dark hole, flipping through the detailed pages that completely documented every single corrupt politician and illegal supply route in Thorne's entire empire. This was the absolute lifeblood of his rival's arrogant syndicate, and now Dominic held it firmly in his black-gloved hands. He looked down at the remaining lockboxes packed tightly with millions of dollars in untraceable street cash, but he did not order his men to steal a single bloody dime. He wanted Thorne to fully understand that this was not a desperate robbery for quick profit, but a highly calculated execution of his entire criminal legacy. Dominic tossed a heavy incendiary flare directly into the massive pile of paper money, watching the bright chemical fire instantly devour the illegal millions with incredible ferocity. The blinding white heat violently illuminated his scarred face, casting long and terrifying shadows against the bloody concrete walls. He tucked the thick ledgers securely under his strong arm and turned his broad back on the roaring inferno, leaving Marcus Thorne's financial hub to burn completely to the ground while he disappeared back into the freezing city mist. The upstate estate felt entirely too quiet with Dominic and his primary strike team operating deep inside the distant city. A heavy freezing rain battered the bulletproof glass of the massive third-floor bedroom, washing the sprawling green grounds in a violently distorting gray blur. Clara sat fully awake in the pitch dark, watching the rhythmic sweeps of the exterior security lights cut sharply through the heavy downpour. She had finally convinced Lily to sleep, tucking the exhausted 8-year-old tightly beneath a massive mountain of heavy silk blankets. The sprawling house felt exactly like a dormant fortress, but Clara's street-honed survival instincts kept her pacing the plush Persian rugs with intense nervous energy. The dull throbbing in her heavily bandaged wrists served as a constant and brutal reminder that Marcus Thorne would not simply wait for his empire to be quietly dismantled. Suddenly, the sweeping security lights positioned along the eastern perimeter completely died, plunging the manicured lawns into absolute pitch blackness. Clara froze instantly by the heavy oak window, her breath catching sharply in her bruised throat as she strained desperately to see through the heavy rain. She did not hear any chaotic alarms or frantic shouting, but the sudden total absence of the exterior lights felt incredibly deliberate and highly tactical. A specialized hit squad had somehow managed to bypass the outer iron gates, and the terrifying reality of their incredibly silent infiltration crashed violently over her entirely isolated position. A single muffled thump echoed faintly from the long marble hallway, sounding exactly like a heavy human body hitting the polished floorboards. Clara did not wait to investigate the grim noise, and she sprinted entirely silently across the dark bedroom to shake her little sister violently awake. "You must wake up right now, and you absolutely cannot make a single sound," Clara whispered frantically directly into Lily's terrified ear. She ripped the heavy silk blankets away and dragged the incredibly disoriented child straight toward the massive antique wardrobe standing deep in the dark corner. She had meticulously memorized the intricate layout of the sprawling guest suite during her 4 days of restless captivity, noting every single architectural detail just in case she needed to suddenly run. She violently shoved the heavy dresses aside and pried open a hidden cedar maintenance panel she had discovered entirely by accident earlier that week. "Crawl deep inside the dark wall and absolutely do not come out until Dominic or I physically open this wooden door," Clara commanded with terrifying absolute authority. Lily squeezed her incredibly small frame into the narrow, dusty space with hot tears streaming down her dirty face, completely disappearing into the hidden shadows just as the heavy bedroom door handle began to slowly turn. Clara quietly clicked the wooden maintenance panel completely shut and grabbed a heavy bronze table lamp, pressing her thin back totally flat against the cold plaster wall. The thick oak door swung slowly open with a quiet mechanical hiss, revealing the massive silhouetted figures of 3 heavily armed men wearing pitch-black tactical gear. The silent intruders swept directly into the dark bedroom with highly practiced military precision, their suppressed rifles raised high and their night vision goggles scanning the empty mattress. Clara knew instantly that they were actively hunting for the surviving girl from the upstate forest, and she possessed absolutely no illusions about surviving a direct physical confrontation with highly trained killers. She desperately needed to create a massive and incredibly chaotic distraction to draw their lethal attention entirely away from the hidden cedar panel concealing her little sister. Clara hurled the heavy bronze lamp straight into the massive antique vanity mirror, shattering the incredibly thick glass with a deafening crash that violently shattered the tense silence. The 3 armed men instantly spun toward the explosive noise, their suppressed weapons spitting deadly rounds that completely shredded the expensive velvet curtains and the heavy wooden vanity. Clara dropped entirely to her bare hands and knees, scrambling frantically across the plush rugs while lethal bullets tore massive chunks of white plaster from the walls directly above her bruised head. She crawled desperately toward the open bedroom door, violently throwing a heavy oak side table directly into the path of the closest charging hostile. The massive man tripped hard over the sudden, unexpected obstacle, his heavy tactical rifle clattering loudly across the wooden floor as Clara slipped smoothly out into the dark marble hallway. She sprinted completely barefoot down the incredibly long corridor, deliberately kicking over priceless porcelain vases and heavy wooden display stands to create a highly chaotic trail of incredible noise. She was actively offering herself up as highly visible prey, drawing the lethal predators as far away from her heavily hidden sister as physically possible. Her frantic sprint ended incredibly abruptly as a heavy-gloved hand violently grabbed her thin shoulder, slamming her brutally against the freezing cold marble wall. One of the tactical intruders raised his suppressed pistol directly toward her bruised face, his thick finger tightening slowly on the sensitive hair trigger. Clara closed her dark eyes and fully prepared for the absolute bloody end, but a deafening roar of unsilenced gunfire suddenly erupted from the opposite end of the dark corridor. Dominic's interior guards had finally rallied from the incredibly sudden stealth breach, and they completely flooded the grand hallway with absolutely overwhelming and highly focused violence. The massive intruder holding Clara was thrown violently backward by 3 incredibly heavy rounds straight to his dark tactical chest plate, instantly dropping his deadly weapon and collapsing into a massive dark pool of his own blood. The remaining syndicate guards pushed rapidly past Clara without speaking a single word, sweeping the entire 3rd floor with cold and highly calculated precision as they systematically eliminated Thorne's desperately trapped hit squad. Clara slumped heavily against the cold marble wall, gasping violently for freezing air as the chaotic gunfire slowly faded into total silence and the emergency backup lights finally flickered brightly to life. The absolute sanctuary of the beautiful gilded cage had been violently and brutally tested, but the incredibly thick walls had held firmly against the rising tide of innocent blood. She pushed herself up on her violently shaking legs and walked incredibly slowly back toward the completely ruined bedroom, knowing with absolute certainty that Lily was perfectly safe behind the cedar panel. The cold upstate morning revealed the shattered glass and bullet-scarred marble of the massive estate, but the true damage was entirely psychological. Dominic Vance walked slowly through the ruined 3rd-floor hallway, his obsidian eyes taking in the massive bloodstains left behind by the slaughtered hit squad. He had built the sprawling sanctuary to be completely untouchable, and Marcus Thorne had dared to drag his filthy street war right over the high iron gates. The incredible disrespect demanded an immediate and highly permanent response that would violently echo through the criminal underworld for the next 10 years. Dominic did not dispatch another faceless team of tactical assassins to actively hunt his rival through the crowded city streets. He sent a single, heavily encrypted message through the highest syndicate channels, formally requesting a traditional sit-down to negotiate a peaceful end to the sudden explosive violence. It was a highly calculated deception designed perfectly to exploit Thorne's massive ego and his desperate, foolish need to appear as a legitimate equal. Thorne accepted the high-level invitation within 2 short hours, completely believing he had actually forced the apex predator directly to the negotiating table. The meeting was firmly set for exactly midnight inside an abandoned meatpacking warehouse down in the freezing industrial district. The freezing Manhattan rain battered the rusted iron roof of the massive warehouse, masking the incredibly quiet movements of Dominic's elite snipers settling into the dark catwalks high above. Marcus Thorne arrived with 20 heavily armed bodyguards, stepping out of a bulletproof sedan with the arrogant swagger of a foolish man who thought he had already won the deadly war. He wore a pristine white suit that glowed unnaturally under the flickering yellow sodium lights, completely contrasting with the filthy industrial shadows surrounding them. Dominic stood perfectly alone in the absolute center of the vast concrete floor, his hands resting casually inside the deep pockets of his tailored black overcoat. Thorne openly mocked the older boss as he walked slowly toward the center, loudly bragging about the recent explosion on Fifth Avenue and the sheer inevitability of his aggressively rising empire. He aggressively demanded massive territorial concessions and a humiliating public apology for the complete fiery destruction of his underground financial ledgers. Dominic listened to the incredibly foolish demands with a completely blank and unreadable expression, calmly letting the younger man dig his own bloody grave with his incredibly arrogant words. He absolutely knew that true lethal power never needed to violently shout its absolute supremacy in the freezing dark. Dominic simply waited in complete silence until Thorne stepped directly into the designated kill zone marked by a single dripping ceiling pipe. Dominic slowly withdrew his right hand from his dark overcoat, casually dropping a single custom silver bullet casing onto the freezing concrete floor. The incredibly sharp metallic clink was the absolute final sound Marcus Thorne ever truly heard as a free and powerful man. Total darkness instantly swallowed the massive warehouse as Dominic's elite technical team violently cut the main power grid from the dark outside street. Suppressed sniper fire violently rained down from the high steel catwalks in a perfectly synchronized wave of absolute clinical destruction. Thorne's 20 expensive bodyguards were systematically erased from the world in exactly 4 seconds, their heavy weapons completely useless against the invisible ghosts actively hunting them from the freezing rafters. The old emergency generator suddenly kicked in with a loud mechanical whine, casting a sickly yellow glow over the massive pile of fresh corpses completely surrounding the suddenly terrified young boss. Thorne fell incredibly hard to his shaking knees, his pristine white suit now heavily splattered with the hot red blood of his completely destroyed crew. Dominic walked slowly forward and smoothly drew his heavy sidearm, looking down at the broken man with the cold and clinical detachment of a grim reaper finally collecting a deeply overdue debt. "You should have never touched that innocent girl in the upstate woods," Dominic whispered quietly, directly before he pulled the heavy trigger and permanently severed the head of the foolish snake. The freezing rain finally stopped falling over the city as Dominic returned to the sprawling upstate estate. He carried the absolute weight of a fully concluded war on his broad shoulders, and his expensive dark suit still smelled faintly of the metallic blood spilled in the abandoned warehouse. Marcus Thorne was permanently erased from the criminal underworld, and the crushing inherited debt of $150,000 was entirely wiped completely clean. Dominic walked slowly into the heavily guarded third-floor guest suite, finding Clara and Lily already packed with the few simple belongings his men had newly provided. Clara looked up at the towering apex predator, her bruised wrists finally healing under fresh white bandages, and she instantly read the absolute finality carved deeply into his stone features. She knew without asking a single question that the violent monsters who had strung her up in the dark forest were completely dead. Dominic handed her a thick manila envelope containing flawless new identification documents and the secure deeds to a quiet house located 3 states away. He had personally established a fully funded anonymous trust in her new name, ensuring the 2 fragile sisters would never have to scrub another filthy floor just to survive. The incredibly dangerous Mafia boss was actively pushing them entirely out of his violent world, firmly sealing the heavy steel doors of his gilded cage right behind them. The heavily armored Mercedes idled quietly in the pristine driveway as the gray morning sun finally broke through the thick upstate fog. Lily ran forward and wrapped her small arms tightly around Dominic's thick legs, burying her clean face directly against his dark overcoat. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently placing his heavy tattooed hand on top of her soft head, allowing himself one incredibly brief moment of genuine human connection before he quickly pulled away. Clara stood quietly by the open car door and looked deeply into his unreadable obsidian eyes, completely understanding the incredibly harsh boundaries he was violently enforcing. He was a ruthless killer who built towering empires on top of shattered bones, and she was a desperate survivor who simply needed a quiet place to heal. "You saved us from the absolute worst of this dark world, and I will never forget what you did," Clara whispered softly over the low rumble of the powerful engine. Dominic did not offer any warm smiles or useless promises of future reunions, because mercy and sentimentality were absolute fatal flaws in his specific line of bloody work. "Do not ever look back at the city, and make sure she grows up entirely safe," Dominic commanded quietly as he stepped back into the freezing shadows of his massive stone estate. The heavy car doors closed with a soft click, and the armored vehicle glided smoothly down the long driveway, carrying the 2 surviving sisters toward a bright and perfectly peaceful future. The towering iron gates closed firmly behind the departing car, completely separating the innocent light from the absolute violent darkness forever. Dominic stood perfectly still in the cold morning air, his terrifying intellect already shifting back to the ruthless maintenance of his massive criminal syndicate. He would never see Clara or Lily again, but the profound impact of their brief and bloody collision had permanently altered the frozen landscape of his heavily guarded soul. Sometimes the darkest monsters in our world are the absolute only ones capable of shielding us from the true unimaginable horrors waiting in the deep shadows. This intense journey shows us that survival often requires incredibly hard choices, and real salvation can sometimes arrive in the absolute most terrifying disguises. Thank you for walking down this incredibly dark and emotional road with us here at Sunni Romance, where we love exploring the incredibly complicated boundaries between ruthless violence and unexpected mercy. What would you have done if you were standing barefoot in that freezing upstate fog? And would you have trusted the apex predator to completely save your family? Let me know your honest thoughts down in the comments below, and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next unforgettable story.